You know, ever since I started this channel that focuses a lot on simplicity and minimalism, something has been bothering me. And I want to talk about it because anything to an extreme can become very toxic. And at times, certain movements and how we talk about things can be exclusionary. And I think it's important to acknowledge the drawbacks of minimalism. So basically, I want to talk about 4 ways that minimalism can be toxic, kind of in hopes that I can reevaluate how I'm pursuing minimalism in my life and maybe help you out too. So I feel like the first problem that I see with minimalism is that minimalism is often conflated with extreme minimalism. Take a second and think about when you hear the word minimalism, what images come to mind? What do you think of? What does a room that's minimalist look like? Well, for me, if I'm honest, sometimes images that come to mind are like completely sparse or empty rooms with almost nothing in it, or living in a van or just out of a backpack. But I feel like realistically, for most of us, that's just not going to be our lifestyle. And I think with family structures, especially if you have kids, I don't have any, but I feel like once you're embedded in a family structure, sometimes belongings just inevitably come more into the mix. When there are more people living together, it's going to add belongings. And even the word minimalism implies that it should be like as minimal as possible, as opposed to something more like lessism. Like maybe that's what I would more subscribe to, is trying to live with a bit less and reducing the excess, as opposed to having to be all the way minimal. However extreme you go, you can always be more extreme. And so it kind of leads you to this feeling of never being satisfied. And you know, maybe being not satisfied helps you push forward. But ultimately, I feel like not enjoying the satisfaction of living with less ultimately leads to more stress, which is not, I think, what the goal of minimalism is. Minimalism can become pretty extreme and lead people to either feel guilt about not being extreme enough or take things to an extreme that just takes all their energy. Like for me, minimalism is about creating more space in my life for the things that matter to me more. Whereas if you take it to the extreme that minimalism implies, you might have to be spending a lot of energy curating that extreme life. And so I just fear that that can take away from meaning and purpose in your life. A second way minimalism is toxic, and I think it's linked to the last one, is that it kind of ignores some societal norms that do pressure us to have belongings. And ultimately that can lead to guilt and negative self-talk. So I think in general in society, there are a lot of expectations around what you're just supposed to have. Here in the US, it's really common to be expected to have a car. Sometimes you kind of need a car to get places or to work. It might be expected that you have several outfits, that you have stuff for all the different seasons, to be able to stay warm or cool when you need to. And then I also think, especially for women, there are a lot of expectations around having lots of hair care products and makeup products and plenty of different outfits. And like there are situations where women often are pressured to have more belongings. Like for example, when you dress up for a wedding, quite often a man can wear a suit or a tux and you just have one, or you rent one and you're able to wear the same one each time. Whereas for women, I would argue, trends move more quickly and you have to keep up with it. And you also are supposed to wear something that maybe looks different each time, or most times. You can't wear the same thing every time. And then with social media and photos, it's like you really can't wear the same thing every time, although maybe you should be able to wear the same thing anytime. But my point is, there is that implicit pressure there to not outfit repeat too much. And I think that's especially strong for women. Somehow I feel like, at least here in the US, culturally, it's more okay if a guy wears the same outfit to work every single day than if a woman does. Maybe I'm wrong about that, and maybe I'm being a little controversial here, but I do feel like there is some level of double standard where, like, for guys, it's cool to kind of be like minimal and like just not worry and kind of try less. Whereas for women, if you don't put effort into that on some level, sometimes you're judged. And I say this from experience in that sometimes when I have repeated outfits, I'm not gonna lie, like people have noticed and commented. And some of those comments aren't always good. Like this is coming from real world circumstances where people were like, oh, you really like to wear that cardigan a lot, don't you? And it being said in a tone that was very clearly negative. So I feel like there are these real external pressures to have more that affect our relationships and our status in various little communities that we're in. And also I think these double standards are problematic because it really, separates the male and female, and instead of seeing gender on a continuum or gender as a non-binary thing, it's like men are supposed to be this way, women are supposed to be that way. It just feels a little archaic, but it's also just all these expectations wrapped into what we're supposed to be and what we're supposed to be projecting to the rest of the world. But I guess what I'm saying is my first point about extreme minimalism being the stereotype, it's like there's this double standard where you're supposed to have a lot of stuff, but then you're also supposed to have nothing in this kind of new wave of minimalism. And it's kind of like ultimately you can't win. And I notice I even have a lot of negative self-talk and just kind of negative thinking about myself, about how I have too much and then how I have too little. And of course, there are way bigger problems in the world than my little internal dialogue about this stuff. But I still think that it can lead to good amounts of guilt for me, maybe especially because I have this YouTube channel about minimalism, but I just feel a lot of guilt around my stuff that feels heavy and weighty and affects my mood. And I think sometimes, especially when there's an extreme minimalist view, especially with a lot of like male minimalism influencers, I feel like it can promote a lot of shame on people, and I think that can be extremely toxic. So I think, at least for me, what I try to do is to take that content with a grain of salt and to realize they're coming from a different life experience and background, and not everything they say has to apply to me. And I think that's true for my content as well. Like, not everything I say may apply to you. You may not agree with everything I say, and that's okay. And that's, good. Like, I think there should be dialogue about these issues, and I may even evolve in my own viewpoint. I guess this is getting a little tangential, but I think ultimately sometimes creating these isms like minimalism, these ideals that we want to get to, it can lead us to feel not good enough and less than, when ultimately it was there in the first place to try to help us. A third way that I think minimalism is toxic, and I think this is a really important one, is that minimalism, at least how it's talked about in society, often ignores people's socioeconomic background. There are a couple of things with this. First of all, there are some people out there who have no choice but to be minimalist because they simply don't have enough money to buy anything more than what's absolutely minimal. And I think that sometimes it's a very privileged problem to be like, I need to declutter and minimize, and it kind of ignores some really important issues in society and people who are truly in need of more. And I think it's important to acknowledge that and to say that out loud. I also think sometimes keeping things is a frugality strategy. So it's like, if you actually keep more, then you don't have to repurchase it later. And so sometimes minimalism is a luxury in a different way. Like, someone who is struggling with money maybe needs to keep some of the items for longer because it would be harder to replace later. And it's easier for the more wealthy to replace the items or to buy items at a better quality. Ultimately, I think for some people who are really struggling financially, minimalism just isn't really an option, or at least the extreme minimalism. And so I guess I feel like one way to address this is just to acknowledge that minimalism is going to look different for different people. And it's important to recognize that not everyone has the luxury to pursue minimalism in this way. That being said, in defense of minimalism, I do think there is a real problem with how many belongings a lot of people in this world, and especially in the US, have. Like, our houses keep getting bigger. We have more and more stuff. According to the LA Times, the average number of belongings Americans have is like 300,000. And who knows if that's even accurate? I wouldn't be surprised if it's more. Like, there is clearly a culture of excess. So it's not like minimalism as a whole is totally out of touch. Like, the idea of trying to live with a bit less is probably a healthy thing for the vast majority of people, at least in the US. But I also want to acknowledge it can be toxic to talk about minimalism in a way that excludes groups of people or doesn't acknowledge the challenges that many people face that either keep them from having much of anything or force them to keep more than maybe what they'd ideally like to keep. Like, I think a lot of us want to come home and have this totally sleek, streamlined, minimal space that's not at all stressful, but when you're working multiple jobs and you have kids and you have a lot going on, it's hard to keep on top of the stuff. And sometimes you need to keep things in order to use them again or reuse them as hand-me-downs or whatever it is. I just think it's important to acknowledge how minimalism can look different for different people, and that sometimes the things I hear around minimalism can be exclusionary to some people. A fourth way minimalism can be toxic is that always assuming less is more can ignore some perspectives and beauty in life. For example, I feel like sometimes in art, minimalism isn't the only way or always the best way. Like, yeah, I like minimalist design and art, but sometimes more is more. Like sometimes really chaotic, beautiful art pieces that have a lot of different colors and pieces and things going on, sometimes that chaos is beautiful. I think individual differences in people, in cultures, in perspectives can be invigorating and help us learn, and no one perspective is the right perspective. And I feel like sometimes minimalists talk in a way that feels like they're on this high horse where it's like minimal design is inherently better and this is the one way to do it. And I just think that that is very short-sighted, and that sometimes more color and pattern and trying things in many different ways is actually a great thing. And not that some minimalism is entirely incompatible with that, but I just think that if everyone were an extreme minimalist, there might be something joyful lost in this world. Like sometimes there can be beauty in some excess in some areas of life. Sometimes having a more eclectic palette can actually feel warm and welcoming and accepting. Ultimately, I think perspective diversity is a great thing. And so I do want to clarify that when I talk about minimalism, first of all, I'm not talking about extreme minimalism. I still have a good amount of stuff around here, but also that I don't want it to diminish your own personal perspective and background and culture. And I just don't think that you should hold yourself back from who you are and kind of the creative parts of you just because you're trying to subscribe to this very narrow view of what minimalism should be. Anyway, there are definitely other ways too that minimalism can be problematic or toxic, but I just wanted to throw out these few, I guess, to start a discussion about it. If you have any thoughts on this, feel free to share them with me in the comments below. Anyway, thank you so much for spending this little bit of time with me, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.